Okay.
We acknowledge the presence of other First Nation citizens who have used Mississaugas of the Credit lands within this territory in the past and who continue to use the lands today. According to our traditions, Mississaugas of the Credit has welcomed other First Nation brothers and sisters, newcomers, and their families, a place to reside since time immemorial. Over 2 centuries ago, the Mississauga people welcomed settlers to our territory, providing them with sustenance and engaging with them in trade and commerce. Much has been done over the past 240 plus years to deny or erase the Mississauga peoples, our rights, way of being, spirituality, and culture. While fighting and prevailing against the weight of oppressive systems, we have always prioritized our members, our community, and the land. I'm sure we are aware that diplomats are responsible for representing and protecting the interests of their sending nation, facilitating strategic agreements, promoting trade and commerce, and fostering friendly relations between nations. As one of those diplomats, I call myself an international diplomat, and every time I'm in the presence of our First Nation leaders, I call them international diplomats, because that's exactly what we are, and our ancestors have traveled by ship across the waters to visit the Queen and make their case on treaty issues here. So as one of those diplomats, on behalf of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, we warmly welcome you to our treaty lands and territories and encourage all of you to continue to learn from, care for, protect, and enjoy this beautiful land and water in and around Toronto. Miigwech, thank you.
So my name is Eamon McKee. I'm Ireland's ambassador to Canada. This is a set of the bronze shoes. There are 33 of these between Roscommon and Dublin, marking the route of the Strokestown tenants on their journey to Dublin, Liverpool and then Canada. They're cast from a pair of children's shoes that were found in the thatch of an 18th century cottage, and as you can see from the detail, they were bound together. We don't know what it meant, but we can imagine what the symbolism infers. In some way, you're always bound to your home, no matter how far you travel. And shoes are often very evocative as a memorial. For example, moccasins are very important to the Indigenous peoples of Canada. For the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation, moccasins are carved into a stone at Port Credit to mark their exodus from their traditional lands when they were ejected from those lands. And even as they were being ejected, they did fundraising for the Irish in 1847, which is a testament to their commitment to the treaty obligations to help an ally in distress. So this is the story of bronze shoes and famine immigrants, moccasins and Indigenous, a story of forced migrations for two peoples.
On the 17th of March, St. Patrick's Day, Thomas Anderson wrote the following to all of the bands and nations within his jurisdiction as Superintendent of Indian Affairs. My dear brethren, there are a few of you who have not at some period of your lives felt the cravings of hunger, but a merciful God has thus far preserved you from the miseries of famine, and none of you have seen their children, their fathers or mothers, their husbands or wives, dying around them from want of food. Brethren, this is now the lamentable case with some of your white friends. Hundreds in Ireland and Scotland are daily passing into the lands of spirits because they have not enough food to keep them alive. Brethren, your great mother the Queen and all of your white brethren throughout the world are collecting money and other measures to save their lives. You also have the means of contributing to the relief of your suffering and dying fellow subjects. Inform me by letter of the amount you wish to give, and I will forward it to your great Father at Montreal, who is pleased when we show acts of kindness to our fellow creatures. Signed, Thomas G. Anderson.
My name is Darren Wybenga. I'm the Traditional Knowledge and Land Use Coordinator for the Mississauga the Credit First Nation. I am reading the letter that Joseph Sawyer and Peter Jones wrote to T.G. Anderson on March 22nd, 1847, regarding famine relief for Scotland and Ireland. Sir, we beg to acknowledge the receipt of your letter of the 17th instant in reference to contributions towards the relief of those perishing for want of food in Ireland and Scotland. We are exceedingly sorry to hear that our fellow subjects in those parts of the world are visited with such awful calamity. Feeling the necessity of rendering aid to such as are in real distress, we gladly subscribe the sum of £12 10 shillings currency out of our land payments, and beg you will have the goodness to pay that amount into the hands of our great Father, the Governor General, that he may forward the same over the great waters. It would have afforded us great pleasure to have given a larger amount, but we regret to inform you that our people here are in a very destitute state, arising from their not having raised any quantity of produce during the last summer, owing to the suspense concerning the removal, and the few potatoes they planted having also proved a failure. We beg also to state that if our people are kept much longer at our villages, their suffering for want of food will be very great, and we shall be obliged to devote larger sums of our annuity to keep them from starvation. We have the honor to be, sir, your obedient servants, Joseph Sawyer and Peter Jones, both signed with their dotem. I find this a very remarkable letter considering our state at that time when the letter was written. We found ourselves just about to be homeless. Our lands at the Credit River were put up for sale, and we had to find a new home. And so in the midst of this, we're contributing to famine relief. We're deeply concerned, we're deeply worried. Where are we going to go? Yet we still find time to contribute to famine relief. And to me, that says a lot about the Mississaugas, I suppose, and First Nations people everywhere. We had to share in order to survive the harsh environment, to live on the land. And so I think it came quite naturally to us to share and reach out and help other people. And so we're very glad to do that, because we were no strangers to starvation in our history either. Scarcely 25, 30 years ago, we went through a period of time in our history where we were in a terrible plight. We were on the verge of extinction or disintegration as a band. Our traditional economy had collapsed. The settlers had moved onto our lands, and we were stricken with all kinds of disease, illnesses, starvation. It was awful. And now we hadn't forgotten either. We have a good memory. We have a very good memory. And I think it's only natural that we reached out to help. And I'm very glad we did. It shows you our friendship and alliance as articulated in that first treaty, I suppose, the 1764 Covenant Chain Wampum Belt, where we were seen as allies on the land. I was very happy to note that one of the signatories of the letter was Chief Joseph Sawyer. He's my 4 times great-grandfather, and he was the chief of our band. His name means the sloping sky. I'm very proud that my distant relative had a role to play in this and expressed a willingness to contribute to such a worthy venture. It's truly humbling, even years later, to read of his activities in this matter. So wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah. So in 1847, when the Mississaugas are at this incredible moment when they're really being pushed off of their own lands. They can no longer stay and continue to prosper or even exist where they were on the Credit River. They're going to have to leave. And at that moment, they are extending support to people they haven't met, who are children of the king. People are reading the newspapers and they're aware that there are these Irish people who are suffering terribly from famine. At the same time, you have to contrast that or think about the experiences of the Mississaugas and other Anishinaabe council fires in Ontario, others who also donated to the Irish Fund, the impact that all this settlement had on them. So at the time of the American Revolution in 1783, these nations were managing their resources, and Anishinaabe peoples were relocating seasonally throughout their territories. The Credit River and the Rouge River were home to huge salmon fisheries, so the community would fish and benefit from mass harvest of that, and lake herring, and there was wild rice. Many of the items they needed for their daily living they were able to make from the land, from the resources of the land, these beautiful black ash baskets, the kinds of woven bulrush mats that they lined their homes, mats for sitting on. All that you needed for life, in other words, other than some luxury goods that you would exchange with for traders, people were able to produce for themselves from their own land. And of course, the arrival of massive numbers of settlers really changed this. It first of all drove the game away. Settlers fenced the land. They competed with the Anishinaabe for the fishing resources extensively. And these are some of the petitions that would come into the Crown. This kinds of essentially settlers arriving and seeing the wealth of this land as theirs to take, and the pittance that people received for the land itself was insufficient to compensate them for what they lost. And so, they really did become quite impoverished by the arrival of so many people. And you can contrast this again with the arrival of 35,000 Irish famine victims in the summer of 1847, who themselves now are displaced, and an additional number of people looking for a place to live, and are coming into this land and into this territory.
We could not get title to our lands. We'd done all these things, but bad birds were always telling us, you do not have the land ownership. It's not yours, it could be taken away. And so that was something that always worried us. We always worried that we would lose what we'd improved. It's not much of an impetus to improve your lands when you're worried that they could be snatched out from underneath of you. So that's a big problem we face. We even send our chief, Peter Jones, to visit Queen Victoria and ask for title to our lands. This is 1838, he actually sees Queen Victoria. She seems to give assent, but unfortunately the prime minister that carried out the plan, Lord Melbourne, he resigned his government, and so that fell through. So no title to our land.
The March 5th petition is signed with the totem images of the male members of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And the number and type of totem images on this document sort of reflect also the space at which this particular council was working and how it had also changed and adapted its own kind of decision-making and governance practices at this particular historical moment. So totem images actually appear very early on documents with the colonial governments. Back as early as 1701 is the first extant copy of a document at the Great Peace of Montreal. And on that document, there was a single totem image representing the entire community, or entire council fire. And it would be the totem image of the Gima, Ogima, or in English, the chief of the community, and that was sort of representative of the entire council fire. And over time, we see, especially in the era of signing treaties, you see this practice continues very much. The governance of each council fire signs the document with totem images that then of the Gima, the Anike Ogima, that's a step below, or deputy chief, which Peter Jones was, and the civil councillors who comprised the council, the primary council. But in the 1830s, the Mississaugas sort of shift their practice a bit, and you start to see on their documents they sign with the totem images of the men of the community, as you start to see many more totem images than you do on other documents. But it really also reflects the kinds of continued interconnected kin relationships, and also how, despite being converted to Christianity, being practicing Methodist, this totem identity remains really important to their sense of themselves as a distinct people, as an Anishinaabe people. Living in the Great Lakes, and as a self-governing people. This is very much an assertion of themselves, making their own autonomous decisions about their future as a self-governing people.
So here we are at the Ribbontail Bridge on the Royal Canal. We've just had a meeting with some school children, and we've talked to them about the story of Indigenous aid to the Irish. I've told them to remember the 4 C's. The famine was a catastrophe. The emigrants went to Canada. They showed great courage, but I also said that this was a story of compassion. The compassion of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe and the Wendat people who, despite their own privations, collected funds to offer famine relief to the Irish. They saw this as human compassion, but also as part of their treaty obligation to their allies. And this is a message that we've told all of the school children along the way and in the interviews that we've done. It's a new story, a new dimension to the famine story, and particularly the story of the Irish famine immigrants in Canada. For the famine immigrants of 1847, they were leaving a very familiar area into a totally unknown world. We can just about see the Dublin mountains. They would have known that they're well past the halfway on their first stage of their journey to Dublin. It must have been quite a poignant moment for them because there was no possibility of their returning. By coincidence, at exactly the same time, the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation were also making their own journey away from their traditional lands at Port Credit, moved to other lands, led by their chiefs Peter Jones and Joseph Sawyer, again to start new lives in a new area, in a new territory. And both of these groups, engaged in forced migration at the same time, are united by the fact that those very same Mississaugas of the Credit Nation offered support to famine immigrants just like those from Strokestown House.
On April 7th, 1847, my 4 times great-grandfather and the Reverend Peter Jones journeyed to the Six Nations of the Grand. They had heard a rumor that the Six Nations were going to invite them to take up land along the Credit River. The Six Nations had heard about our impending state of homelessness, and they had remembered what we had done for them when they had lost their lands during the time of the American Revolution. And now we heard rumors that they wanted to return the favor to us. So my great-grandfather and Peter Jones made their way there, and they met the Six Nations chiefs in council, and they struck a tentative deal, okay? But before they actually struck the deal, they exchanged a lot of pleasantries, and one of the things that was also exchanged, at least by my great-grandfather, was the state that the Mississaugas at the Credit River were in. We were severely distressed, and well, here's what he said to Henry Brant. He was the Speaker of the Six Nations at the time. "Brother, I have just told you the extent of our lands, and I have now to tell you that it is owned by another race of people. I am now reduced to so little that I have scarcely enough to stand upon. My brother, I now tell you of the poverty our people are in. The small tract we have, the white man keeps hemming us in, and is taking away our wood. I'm afraid that my children will not have wood to make fires to keep them warm, that we must seek a place where they will not die from cold. Now, that was a serious problem. The settlers were encroaching on our lands at the Credit River, and indeed they were cutting down our wood. And it wasn't just the encroachment of our lands, it was also the example that the settlers set for our people. And sometimes the settlers had habits that we really did not appreciate too much. They brought alcohol in the vicinity of our people, and we were scared that that was going to set our people back, that they were going to, it was going to harm us. And now in 1847, we had advanced sufficiently along the road that we had built this prosperous village. We'd cleared 900 acres of land, and we feared that if we were caught up in the snares of alcohol, that we might revert. And especially we were worried for our young people that they might not be so capable of resisting the temptation of the firewater, as we called it. So we were very much alarmed at the amount of people coming to the vicinity of our lands.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is the beginning of a painting. Yesterday I did the drawing freehand, and I started out with a real image of Peter Jones. I don't know if you can see that, but this is a black and white image. I liked everything, but I couldn't get a really good angle on the edge of the face, so I decided to make my own profile using the woodland style painting. And once I did the image, like this profile of the face, I decided that's the way I was going to go. I really like the way this is looking. And woodland style is really second nature to Anishinaabe, Ojibwe style painting. And they call it woodland style because it's based on an offshoot of the pictographs and petroglyphs. And those are thousands of years old, this style of imagery. I thought it would be important to add that harp on the sleeve of Peter Jones. And you know, for a long time the harp was a real powerful symbol of the Irish people. It was a musical instrument that was very important to them since the Dark Ages, and it was part of their symbol that recognized the people since those Dark Ages. This is a gift, an offering from our nation to yours, that you might think about us and that we are thinking of you.
This is a painting by Anishinaabe artist Philip Cote called Sacred Feathers. It's in the woodland style, and it depicts Peter Jones, Sacred Feathers, chief of the Mississauga of the Credit, commemorating the gift of the Mississauga of the Credit to Irish Famine Relief in 1847. And as you can see by the painting, there's even the emblem of Ireland on his cloak. The story of the donation from the Mississauga of the Credit is rather tragic, because this is a group of Indigenous peoples that had been granted lands in their treaty obligations with the Crown at the mouth of the Credit River flowing into Lake Ontario. They had produced several industries there. They had a thriving community in terms of business and social life, but often afflicted by crop failures, including the potato. And in 1847, their lands were now being seriously encroached by settlers and squatters, and they were forced essentially to abandon their lands and move elsewhere. The interesting irony to this story is that in the midst of them preparing to move, they receive the letter from Thomas Anderson about Irish Famine Relief, and unhesitatingly, both Peter Jones and Joseph Sawyer sign a letter on behalf of the council that indicates that they will give, but they are very poor and they are about to lose their homes. In fact, within days of their letter being sent to Anderson, their lands went up for auction to other settlers. And the cruel irony of this is that many of these settlers and squatters would have been British settlers, some of whom were Irish, and perhaps some who are actually famine refugees. Eventually, the Mississauga found a home in the lands now occupied by the Six Nations. And so the tragedy here is, in their generosity, they were giving not of their superfluous goods, but of their very selves. The great sadness of leaving credit and all that had been there was expressed quite eloquently by Peter Jones when he said, "Not a family, but left behind the sacred dust of some relative."
Irish famine immigration to Canada marks the end of Irish settlement in Canada in terms of large numbers. The Irish had been coming to Canada for over 300 years. Thereafter, Irish immigration really goes to the United States. But the Irish settlement in Canada is part of transatlantic colonialism, carried out, of course, at the expense of the Indigenous of Canada, and this was a very unhappy story for them. One of the happier outcomes, however, was that the Irish themselves empathised with the Indigenous experience. And partly because of the memory of their help during the famine, the Irish national lacrosse team stepped aside to allow the Indigenous Iroquois team participate in the Lacrosse World Games. Inspired by this story, Cheyenne Lazor from Akwesasne came to the gratitude event that we hosted at the embassy, where we planted 3 river birch trees in remembrance of the support of the Indigenous during the famine. And she made a special ribbon skirt with Irish motifs as a gift to us in remembrance of our accommodation for the lacrosse Iroquois team and their participation in the lacrosse championship.
Sego zewogwego Cheyenne Yungets, Akwesasne Nuetenagule, Wagatohuni. Hello, my name is Cheyenne Lazor. I'm from the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation and I'm a member of the Wolf Clan people. When Ireland forfeited their spot for the Haudenosaunee Nationals lacrosse team, I decided to create a skirt to give thanks to Team Ireland for giving our communities the opportunity to participate in the world stage. It's my belief that because of my ancestors' contributions through aid for the Irish famine in 1847, that inspired Team Ireland to reciprocate the offer as an act of generosity, as an act of kindred spirits towards the Haudenosaunee people. The skirt was a representation of my thanks to them, shown through my artwork the best way I know how. We took the picture with my daughter's lacrosse stick in the background, with my friend Sky, who is of Mohawk and Irish descent, and she's actually wearing the Team Ireland shirt in the picture. She's a very beautiful model, and I just want to thank her for doing that with me as well. And the ribbon skirt is something that Indigenous people wear for special occasions, for ceremony, and in this case it was a way to say thank you to Team Ireland.